If you're wondering how to most effectively prepare for the 2024 revision to the CISSP exam, you've come to the right place. Welcome. In this video, I'll drill down on every new topic mentioned in the 2024 exam syllabus, as well as cover significant updates for standards that have evolved since 2021, and I'll share insights here you will not find anywhere else. We'll also touch on cloud computing topics that are relevant to security leaders, as public cloud will factor more prominently in the 2024 exam, potentially substantially more so. And I'm going to quickly show you the must-have as well as some nice-to-have exam prep materials to give you an edge as you prepare. Whether you're watching this video before or after April 15th, 2024, it's intended to lay a path to a win on exam day without wasting time or money. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. Welcome to the CISSP Exam Cram 2024 Exam Addendum, with in-depth coverage of all the new and updated topics in the 2024 revision of the CISSP exam. As with all my exam prep resources, you'll find a PDF copy of the presentation available for download in the video description. And in that video description, you'll also find a clickable table of contents so you can move forward and back through topics as necessary as you prepare for the exam. So let's talk for a moment about what you can expect in the 2024 revision to the CISSP. When we look at the 2021 exam, it was a 4-hour adaptive exam with 125 to 175 questions, moving down to a 3-hour exam with 100 to 150 questions as of April 15th, 2024. So while you might breathe a sigh of relief, that actually means you have as little as 1.2 minutes per question if you take the full 150 questions to pass the exam. The difference in questions there, incidentally, is now we have only 25 unscored questions where before there were 50. But bottom line, you have to manage your time just a bit more effectively in the 2024 update to this exam. In terms of the domains, we see the same 8 domains we had in the 2021 revision, and the domain weightings are very, very similar. You see just 2 domains there with a 1% shift, which means fundamentally no change in how you prepare for this exam. And while in theory it is possible to pass this exam while failing one of these domains, I would say generally speaking that is fairly unlikely. So plan to study for this exam in such a way that you're definitely going to pass all 8 of these domains. So let's talk about how we assess the changes from the 2021 version of this exam to this 2024 revision. First and foremost, it's important to understand the changes are incremental. The 2021 exam topics still apply. With 2024, we see a few new topics, we see some updated topics, and some topics have been elevated to direct mention in the exam syllabus, meaning they were covered in the 2021 revision, but they're now mentioned explicitly in the syllabus. And in my mind, that means elevated importance or relevance. Some topics have simply moved around or been reworded, sometimes with examples added. So if there's no significant change there, we'll simply ignore those and let the 2021 content ride. You should assume that cloud computing will factor more prominently in the 2024 version of the CISSP exam, potentially substantially so. So as we go through new topics in 2024, we will cover those from the aspect of cloud computing where that's appropriate. But again, remember, all of your preparation for the 2021 version of the exam still applies. So I will talk about major topics and minor topics, so I want to just make one point of clarification here. If we look at a domain, for example, Domain 3, Security Architecture and Engineering, we have a new section there, 3.10, Manage the Information System Lifecycle. That's what we'd call a major new topic. Beneath 3.10, we have 3.10.1 through 3.10.9. These are minor topics. So it's important to bear in mind that the major topic will provide context for the minor topic, and this will become more important when we have minor topics that appear to be pure duplication. They're not, and that will become apparent soon enough when we get to Domain 6, but park that for now. And here we are in March of 2024 without a new official study guide yet for the 2024 exam. So for the moment, if you use my CISSP exam cram tailored to the 2021 exam, coupled with this 2024 addendum, you have coverage of the most critical topics for the exam and all of the new topics in 2024. And I'll release an updated exam cram sometime in Q2, but this should not delay your start. I'm a big fan of minimizing cost. It's why I do what I do. We all have limited resources, so if you can do something for $30 instead of $3,000, that's just smart. However, if you have a little budget and you want to give yourself a leg up in your exam prep, I have a couple of suggestions for you. Give me 5 minutes and I'll give you a quick tour of the must-have resources you need to prepare for the 2024 revision of the CISSP exam, as well as a look at a couple of nice-to-have, inexpensive resources I believe at the end of the day you'll find are a good use of your budget. And I'll share how to move forward both before and after the 2024 revision of the official study guide is eventually published. Now, I've already shared a detailed exam prep strategy that really works, I promise. You'll find that in my exam prep full course, so I'll focus here for just a couple of minutes on exam prep materials. And if you're comfortable with your plan, you have your materials in hand, simply go down to the clickable table of contents, click on that next chapter, and I'll see you there. But if you'd like a bit of steering on how to get across the finish line a bit faster with a bit less effort, stick around and I'll give you the nickel tour. So in terms of printed matter, let's talk about the must-have resources here. So certainly the official study guide and practice test bundle are a must, and let me explain why. So the official study guide, obvious enough. This gives you the topics you need for your targeted reading, but you also get 1,000+ practice questions at the end of each chapter. So that's a nice drill down on each chapter, but using the 9th edition of the guide is fine until the 10th is available. Now, the official practice test, which may feel optional to you, really shouldn't be, and here's why. Because it includes 100 questions for each domain, which makes it easier to drill down on your weak spots on a per domain basis. So actually, let me just show you quickly what I mean. Let me just switch to a browser quickly, and I'm already on the Wiley Efficient Learning site, and you'll see that I've registered the official study guide and the practice test book, and it's the practice test book I wanted to show you. So when I click the Go to Test Bank, it will take me to the quizzes available for this book. Now, the test book is actually arranged in 8 chapters, and each chapter maps to a specific domain. So you can just deselect everything and pick a specific chapter which maps to the domain you'd like to drill down on, and then you pick the number of questions you'd like to include in that quiz based on the time you have, and take the quiz. As simple as that. And because that bundle is only about $3 more than the official study guide alone, it's absolutely worth it to get those 100 question sets for each of the chapters. Not to mention, when you look at the practice test at the end here, once you've more or less strengthened yourself across all 8 domains, then you can take some practice exams of around 125 questions, so something resembling the length of the real exam. But that should allow you to drill down a little more effectively. Now, one of the most common questions I get is, how do I access those online resources that come with the official study guide and practice test bundle? I have a how-to that will walk you through the online registration in case you're struggling. Look for a YouTube tutorial link in the video description. And on the topic of exam resources, not required material, but I think nice to have, will be the CISSP The Last Mile guide that I will release in May of 2024. Much like my video content, designed to be a very consolidated, targeted resource to help you get across the finish line on your first or next attempt at the CISSP exam. And if you visit that URL and put your name in, you'll get a notification when the book is published in May. And if you've listened to my content before, you know I'm a big fan of spending as little time and money as possible in preparation. But if you do want to spend some small dollars to give yourself a leg up, I want to tell you about a couple of nice-to-have, optional resources, that is, that can give you an advantage as you prepare. So we'll talk about Pocket Prep, the exam flashcards from Inside Cloud and Security, yours truly. And I want to mention Certification Station. So starting with Pocket Prep, this is an online exam engine. So I like these folks for a couple of reasons. So number one, they have per domain progress tracking. They have multiple quiz modes, so you can take time quizzes, you can create bite-sized quizzes, you can focus on your weakest subjects, or you can go into more of an exam mode. And they have full capability to really build your own. But they also have a great mobile experience. I really like their mobile app. It's about $21 a month. I'll put a link in the video description if you're interested in some high-quality questions. I really do like the Pocket Prep product. And the exam flashcards from Inside Cloud and Security were developed by my team and I to close the gap on what we saw as a shortage of high-quality and comprehensive flashcards for the CISSP exam. So for the 2024 update, we have over 1,100 cards curated by my team and I. You can choose to study by domain or any one of about 50 categories, so we've done the chunking for you. And it covers all your terms and concepts, any glossary terms that come with the official study guide, as well as the common list of acronyms you see out there. And the exam flashcards work on any desktop or mobile, so you can literally study from anywhere, any device. And on the cards themselves, you'll find a little flag in the upper right, so you can flag any weak subjects for later review. You can choose the number of cards that you want down here at the bottom, for bite-sized sessions we call them. You'll notice the official study guide reference. We give you the page numbers whenever the page numbers are available. Believe it or not, there are actually some topics that don't appear in the official study guide. We offer additional reading links that will take you to an authoritative external source. Exam tips where they are applicable. If there's some tip around exam focus, we're going to drop it behind that button. And then you'll see links to our videos out on YouTube, so the Exam Cram series specifically. And on the mobile side, you'll see that you can simply browse from any mobile browser to use the cards. You can log in from desktop or mobile with your preferred social ID, so you don't have to create yet another ID to use the flashcards. It's about $5 a month, billed on a quarterly subscription. And I will say we cover multiple exams, and for that fee you get access to all of the exams that we cover. So with the prelims out of the way, let's get down to business. Let's have a look at what's new in Domain 1, Security and Risk Management. And there are a handful of meaningful updates we'll want to drill down on here, so I'll list out the updates here in Domain 1 and then we'll get into the technical details. So in 1.3 we see the word sustain added to the description. Minor rewording, you can safely ignore it. I just wanted to give you one example of rewording that really means nothing in terms of its impact to your study. Now 1.3.4, Security Control Frameworks, is an existing topic, but we noticed that they mentioned FedRAMP and SABSA, the Sherwood Applied Business Security Architecture, explicitly. FedRAMP was barely mentioned in the official study guide in 2021, certainly not explained at all, and SABSA is mentioned nowhere whatsoever. So the fact that these went from virtually no mention or no mention to being directly called out in the syllabus, we're going to spend a bit of time on these. Then we see 1.4.5, issues related to privacy regulations. Similar situation here. Privacy regulations were covered on the 2021 exam, but there are two examples called out here, not at all mentioned in the official study guide, so we'll drill down on those standards, those additional regulations, if you will. 1.7.2, External Dependencies for Business Continuity. This is a new topic. I would say supply chain security has really come front and center in the last 3 years, so I'm not surprised to see that here. Now 1.9.9, in risk frameworks, we see SABSA mentioned again as an example. We'll talk about SABSA and how it relates to security control frameworks and risk frameworks. Interesting that it's mentioned for both. 1.11, supply chain risk management concepts. Again, that reference to our external supply chain. In risk mitigations, we see specifically Silicon Root of Trust and physically unclonable function both called out, not at all mentioned in the 9th edition of the official study guide, and software bill of materials, again, one of those emerging concepts. Software bill of materials is a topic almost no one was thinking about in 2021 to something everyone is thinking about and many companies are beginning to use. And 1.12.2 is periodic content reviews to include emerging technologies. And I wanted to call that out simply to say this is a common sense update. We educate our users through security awareness training generally on a quarterly basis. This line item simply calls out that you should include emerging technologies. Of course, when we deliver that quarterly security training, we're bringing in new and evolving topics. This is common sense, be aware of it. No need for us to spend any time on it. And one more side note here, and that's the 5 pillars of information security. You're going to see this called out in the 2024 exam syllabus. The 5 pillars are confidentiality, integrity, availability, authenticity, and non-repudiation. All concepts covered in the previous version of the exam. They are not new, but we don't see the 5 pillars phrasing referenced in the 2021 exam. So basically, know that when you see the 5 pillars on the 2024 exam, that's what it refers to. So let's talk about the Sherwood Applied Business Security Architecture, or SABSA, which was not mentioned in the official study guide for the 2021 exam, but now appears in both risk and security control frameworks in the syllabus. So let's talk about what security control frameworks and risk frameworks actually are. Let's juxtapose the two. A security control framework provides a prescriptive set of security safeguards and best practices to protect an organization's assets. It helps in implementing the risk management strategy. And then we have risk frameworks, which provide a structured approach to identifying, assessing, prioritizing, and managing risk to guide decision making. So the role of the risk framework is to provide the overarching structure for making risk-informed decisions. Now the question is, where does SABSA fit into these two areas, which are 1.3.4 and 1.9.9 on the syllabus? Well, the SABSA is a security architecture framework and methodology. It focuses on aligning security with business goals by providing a structured method for designing, implementing, and managing security architectures. Bottom line, it can be used in conjunction with both risk frameworks and security control frameworks. It adds a layer focused on practical security architecture implementation. Let me say it more simply, more plainly. Risk frameworks focus on the why. They guide strategic decision making about risk. Security control frameworks address the how, providing specific controls to mitigate cybersecurity risks. And SABSA adds another how layer by focusing on the structure and design of the security architecture itself. And the 2021 exam material, which is carried forward to 2024, mentions risk frameworks and security control frameworks repeatedly. So now you have some foundation as to the focus of each of those two concepts. And on that topic of risk and security control frameworks, I want to talk to you about NIST's Risk Management Framework and NIST's Cybersecurity Framework. I want to simply frame a couple of facts here that will help you in assessing questions that include these two. So the RMF's audience is federal government agencies, and the RMF is mandatory for those audiences to which it applies, which are government agencies. Now the Cybersecurity Framework, the CISSP, is aimed at private, commercial businesses, and the CISSP is purely optional guidance from NIST, though both address cybersecurity risk management. But if you weren't clear about the focus and the difference between the two, now you know. So also mentioned in the 2024 syllabus, but barely mentioned in the 2021 official study guide, is FedRAMP, the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program. This is a government-wide program that provides a standardized approach to security assessment, authorization, continuous monitoring for cloud products and services. So based on that statement alone, the goals are pretty clear. They want to accelerate secure cloud adoption, enhance trust in cloud solutions, but perhaps most importantly, provide a reusable approach for multiple agencies, establishing a common way of doing things for these government agencies that many times have common needs. Next, I want to talk to you about another standard I expect will get more attention on the 2024 update to the exam and has been updated significantly for 2022 and beyond, and that is ISO 27001, which had an update in 2022. It outlines a framework for implementing, maintaining, and continually improving an information security management system. An ISMS is a set of policies, processes, and controls that helps organizations protect their information assets. Essentially, it guides organizations in identifying information assets and assessing their value and the associated security risks, and implementing mitigating security controls based on ISO 27002, and then regularly monitoring and measuring effectiveness of and continuously improving that information security management system. So we've heard 1,000 times that securing our information is not a one-time thing, right? It's a continuing process where we have to monitor, measure, manage, and improve over time because the bad actors out there are constantly evolving their game. But cloud security is now included in the 2022 update to the standard. We know cloud security will factor more prominently in the 2024 update to the exam, and ISO 27001 is really a standard certification for the big cloud service providers out there. So Microsoft Azure, Amazon's AWS, Google Cloud Platform, they all have an ISO 27001 certification on one thing or another. And then going hand in hand with this is ISO 27002, which offers best practices and control objectives related to key aspects of cybersecurity expressly in support of ISO 27001. So 27002 focuses on access control, cryptography, human resource security, operational security, incident response. There are elements of physical security in there. But bottom line, it serves as a practical blueprint for organizations aiming to effectively safeguard their information assets against cyber threats. So ISO 27001 focuses more on the what and the why, and ISO 2702 supports by providing practical guidance on the how, because organizations can certify on ISO 27001 as an attestation to their implementation of good, solid information security best practices. And ISO 27002, which is a much larger document than ISO 27001 in reality, provides the guidance on how to do that. So I want to shift gears and talk about issues related to privacy. I did mention that there are a couple of standards called out in the syllabus in section 1.4.5 that were not mentioned at all in the previous release of the CISSP. But before we get into some of the more nuanced information around privacy and the legal sphere and cloud, I want to just frame a couple of fundamental concepts here to ensure that you're clear. A couple of areas where I see folks do tend to have questions. So let's begin with privacy versus confidentiality. What exactly is the difference? Well, privacy is the right of an individual to have some control over their personal information, how it's collected, used, and potentially disclosed. So we're talking about personally identifiable information and protected health information first and foremost. Confidentiality, on the other hand, is the duty of an organization and their officers to ensure private information is kept secret to the extent possible. That's a legal obligation in regulatory scenarios and a due care obligation under U.S. law. So bottom line, privacy focuses on the rights of the individual person or customer, and confidentiality focuses on data. And on the topic of encryption and privacy, there are a few standards you're expected to be familiar with for the exam, and I want to touch on the most important and fundamental of these. So U.S. companies cannot export certain encryption technologies to what are termed rogue nations. That means Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Sudan, and Syria. This list may change from time to time, but they're talking about what are considered rogue nations. And encryption export controls come from the Department of Commerce. They detail the limitations on the export of these encryption products outside the U.S. Now, privacy in the United States is based in the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So all rules around privacy really begin there. Now, in the EU, GDPR is the standard for privacy, and it's not a U.S. law, it's an EU law, but GDPR applies to any company with customers in the European Union, so general data protection regulation is very likely to come up on the exam. And there are a few U.S. privacy laws that you may see. In the world of healthcare, you'll see HIPAA and HITRUST. In the health sphere, you'll see Graham-Leach-Bliley, which applies to financial institutions, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, and the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. Now, you'll notice each of these has an acronym. I would recommend memorizing those acronyms, just in case they appear on questions, even as a distractor. So let's talk about those two laws I mentioned that are new to the 2024 exam. Not new laws, but just new to the exam. So there's the Personal Information Protection Law, which is effective since late 2021 and aims to establish a comprehensive framework for the protection of personal information in China. And then the Protection of Personal Information Act, which was enacted in 2013 and establishes regulations for the responsible processing of personal information by both public and private entities in South Africa. Both address data collection, security, usage, and deletion. They're not U.S.-based laws. Are they very likely to come up on the exam? Hard to tell a month before the exam gets here, but I wanted to make sure if you see these, you recognize where they are from. At the very least, that you don't mistake them for U.S.-based law. So to summarize, if we just summarize privacy laws on the exam, so under the U.S. federal law category, we see Graham-Leach-Bliley in the financial world. We saw HIPAA High-Tech for health, COPA for children, ECPA for electronic, CALEA, the Law Enforcement Act, relates to wiretapping rights. Now, you'll see a U.S. state law for California come up on the exam, potentially. That's the California Consumer Privacy Act. I don't think that's exceedingly likely to be on the exam, but it's definitely called out in the official study guide. Now, on the international side, we see GDPR. We see PIPL in China, and then the POPIA in South Africa. GDPR, hands down, the most important for the exam. And for the U.S., I'd strongly suggest you focus on the federal laws. And in the realm of privacy, I think it's important that you're familiar with the Privacy Impact Assessment and its objectives. So a PIA is designed to identify the privacy data being collected, processed, or stored by a system and to assess the effects of a data breach. So when is a privacy impact assessment necessary? Well, several privacy laws explicitly require PIAs as a planning tool for identifying and implementing required privacy controls, including GDPR from the European Union and HIPAA, the U.S. healthcare law. So conducting a PIA typically begins when a system or process is being evaluated. However, evolving privacy regulation often necessitates assessment of existing systems. To conduct a privacy impact assessment, you have to define the assessment scope, your data collection methods, and a plan for data retention. There's an organization called the International Association of Privacy Professionals who have published guides and resources related to privacy efforts, including developing your plan for a privacy impact assessment. So I want to talk about jurisdictional differences in data privacy. This gets particularly interesting in the cloud sphere when we're thinking about public cloud, because different laws and regulations may apply depending on the location of your data subject, the data collector, the cloud service provider, subcontractors who are processing that data, and the company headquarters of the entities involved. This raises legal concerns that you have to consider. may prevent the utilization of a specific cloud service provider because they don't have a location in the right country. It can add to cost and time to market, and it can drive changes to technical architectures required to deliver the services. You never want to replace compliance with convenience when you're evaluating services, as this increases risk and your liability. And many privacy frameworks impose fines or other actions for non-compliance. But when we talk about location, we're often talking about data residency. Where does the data reside? And many countries have very specific rules around this, so you really have to be careful about compliance in these areas. And in the cloud, it's not always clear where our data resides, so we need to be very careful about that when we implement public cloud services. So I'm going to talk on a topic here that I'm going to call extra credit, but it's an important subject and one that may well come up on the exam, certainly a leadership topic, and that's around conflicting international legislation. It's important to be aware of the various laws and regulations that govern cloud computing. We see a lot on this topic in the ISC squared exam called the CISSP, the Certified Cloud Security Professional. But laws can introduce risks to a business like fines, penalties, or even a loss of the ability to do business in a certain place. So it's important to identify risks and make recommendations to mitigate them just like any other risk. So let me give you an example. This is a conflict between GDPR and the Cloud Act, which is a U.S. regulation. So GDPR forbids the transfer of data to countries that lack adequate privacy protections. Now, the U.S. Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Cloud Data, or Cloud Act, requires CSPs to hand over data to aid in investigation of serious crimes, even if that data is stored in another country. So GDPR forbids the transfer of data, and the Cloud Act requires the transfer of that data. So you can see these two colliding. So which law prevails when the two are in conflict? Great question, and the answer is not always going to be clear, so it's going to require some collaboration. Legal counsel will generally need to be part of the evaluation of any cloud-specific risks, legal request, and the company's response to these. Because remember this, there's one thing we cannot transfer to another party, and that is accountability. The consumer, the customer, is responsible for navigating these challenges. And I mean the customer in the context of the company that is subscribing to the cloud service. So if I am a US-based company doing business in the European Union and I have a situation where GDPR and the Cloud Act collide, I need to get my legal counsel involved, and we need to sort that out and work with the governing entities to come to the right conclusion. Which just calls attention to a fact we've long mentioned in the world of the CISSP exam, that sometimes the right answer is call in an expert. As a business leader, as a security leader, you need to know when you need to bring in that qualified opinion. We can't always be the expert in the room. So continuing down this road, cloud practitioners need to be aware of multiple sets of laws and regulations and the risks that are introduced in this conflicting scenario. So copyright and intellectual property law, particularly the jurisdictions that companies need to deal with, local versus international, to protect and enforce their IP protections, because intellectual property rights are not recognized in all countries. Safeguards and security controls required for privacy compliance, particularly the details of data residency or the ability to move data, what we call data transfer, move data between countries, as well as varying requirements of due care in different jurisdictions. Data breaches and their aftermath, particularly breach notification. For example, GDPR has a 72-hour notification deadline when you have a data breach. And then I mentioned international import and export laws. I cited some examples there, but particularly technologies that may be sensitive or illegal under various international agreements. Now, on the CISSP exam, we often say that there are often multiple answers that are plausible, but there's always a best answer. So I want to talk to you about prioritization of some different concepts, starting with laws. So laws are the legal rules that are created by government entities like legislatures, like the U.S. Congress, for example. Regulations are the rules that are created by governmental agencies. Now, when it comes to laws and regulations have to be followed or they can result in civil or criminal penalties for the organization. Civil meaning resulting in a fine or a sanction, and a criminal penalty which can involve someone going to jail for a crime. We then have standards that dictate a reasonable level of performance. They can be created by an organization for its own purpose, so an internal standard, or they can come from industry bodies or trade groups, external standards. And then we have frameworks that are a set of guidelines helping organizations improve their security posture. So when we look at these and prioritize, laws and regulations are more important than standards and frameworks. So if we have a question that poses a scenario where we have various answer choices that include laws and regulations or standards and frameworks, adhering to the laws and regulations would be more important. Moving on to Section 1.72, External Dependencies, which are entities outside the organization that it depends on for business continuity, disaster recovery, or operations in this context. Examples would be your ISPs, your utility companies, any providers of recovery sites, fuel for your generators. These are really elements of your supply chain. The bottom line here, the organization should not rely on a single vendor for a specific function during a disaster who may be impacted by the same event. To have a disaster that also affects your disaster recovery partners would be a special kind of disaster, indeed. Moving forward to Section 1.11.2, Risk Mitigations in Supply Chain Risk Management. We see a couple of risk mitigations mentioned in the examples here for this line item that are not mentioned at all in the 2021 revision. And they center around the hardware root of trust. So let's just cover hardware root of trust, and then we'll get into those new items. So hardware root of trust is a line of defense against executing unauthorized firmware on a system. And when certificates are used, for example in full disk encryption, they use a hardware root of trust for key storage, which verifies that the keys match before the secure boot process takes place. The Trusted Platform Module, or TPM, and the Silicon Root of Trust are both implementations of a hardware root of trust. In fact, the TPM is what is used in BitLocker full disk encryption on the Windows platform. Now, Silicon Root of Trust is one of two that were called out as examples that we didn't see in the 2021 exam, so I wanted to define those for you here. So we have the Silicon Root of Trust, which is a specialized chip or module embedded directly into the hardware of a device, like a server, or we see IoT, Internet of Things, called out frequently when it comes to Silicon Root of Trust. It contains a unique, unchangeable cryptographic identity that is established during manufacturing that acts as an anchor for verifying the integrity of the system's firmware. The unchangeable cryptographic identity is often called its immutable fingerprint. And if the firmware is compromised, the Silicon Root of Trust will detect the change because the signature no longer matches and prevent the system from booting. And the other example called out on the 2024 syllabus is the physically unclonable function, which is a hardware component that generates a digital fingerprint or signatures based on unique physical characteristics of the integrated circuit or chip itself, typically a semiconductor device. But when a physically unclonable function is queried or given a challenge, it responds with a unique output based on the chip's inherent variations. This response, like a fingerprint, is impossible to clone or recreate on another device. But physically unclonable functions are a unique hardware root of trust, and they have multiple uses in hardware security, including secure key generation, device authentication, anti-tampering, and of course, secure boot. And to close out Domain 1, also here in 1.11.2, we have the Software Bill of Materials, more commonly referred to as SBOM. This is a list of all software components, libraries, and modules that go into a particular software build or product. The SBOM really functions as the inventory of all the building blocks that make up a software product. All of those components, be them internal or external. It helps organizations better understand, manage, and secure their applications because they have a holistic view and a detailed view of all the components that make up that application. There was a high-profile attack in 2020 that led a U.S. government requirement for SBOM in the 2021 Executive Order on Improving the Nation's Cybersecurity. And this is one of those topics I would see as likely to come up on a question here or there, because SBOM is not something anyone was talking about back in 2021, but it's something not only is everyone talking about now, but many organizations are using. What's new in Domain 2, Asset Security, is a very short discussion because there are no new major or minor topics in Domain 2, and this is an outlier. This is the only domain where there are no new major or minor changes, but what we saw in 2021 rides. Moving on, let's take a look at what's new in Domain 3, Security Architecture and Engineering. So new in Domain 3, we have 3.1.11, Secure Access Service Edge. And in 3.6.3, Public Key Infrastructure, not a new topic, but the example provided here, Quantum Key Distribution, is a topic not mentioned in the 2021 official study guide, so we're going to cover that here. A new major topic in 3.10, Manage the Information System Lifecycle, with 9 subtopics here, which are the phases of the information system lifecycle. I'll cover the key activities and goals of each phase, as well as the most important security objective for each phase of the process. And while not called out explicitly in the exam syllabus, there are some evolving concepts around key management that we need to talk about, so I'll cover a couple of items under 3.6.1 that will be relevant to the exam. Let's start with Secure Access Service Edge, which is a design philosophy closely related to Zero Trust network architecture. Abbreviated with the acronym SASE, pronounced SASE, it brings together networking and security functions and delivers them as an integrated cloud service. SASE components include firewall services, secure web gateways, anti-malware services, intrusion prevention, a cloud access security broker or CASB function, and data loss prevention. Now, Gartner first described SASE in 2019 as a network model that merges traditional WAN management and security capabilities into a unified whole. SASE is built, implemented, and managed using cloud-native architectures. It's a response to the edge-centric trends in mobility, cloud, SD-WAN, and the Internet of Things. It's really WAN implementation in the world of hybrid and public cloud, but first described in 2019 and still considered an emerging, evolving cybersecurity concept. I mentioned that in section 3.6.1, the cryptographic lifecycle, there is some emerging content I wanted to visit with you about, and it starts with FIPS 140-2, Federal Information Processing Standard, which was established to aid in the protection of digitally stored, unclassified yet sensitive information. Not a new topic on the exam, but we're going to cover FIPS 140-2, and then I'll tell you what is new around the FIPS standard. So this was developed by NIST for use in computer systems by non-military American government agencies and government contractors. Now there are FIPS security levels, 3 levels with FIPS 140-2 that you'll want to know for the exam. There's level 1, which is the lowest level of security. Level 2 that specifies the security requirements for cryptographic modules that protect sensitive information, and level 3 that requires physical protections to ensure a high degree of confidence that any attempts to tamper are evident and detectable. So it's a good idea to remember the FIPS security levels for the exam. But it's worth mentioning that FIPS 140-3 was released, and as of April 1st, 2022, supersedes FIPS 140-2 for new submissions for certification. And FIPS 140-3 comes with its own security levels. In fact, it has 4 instead of 3. Level 1 requires production-grade equipment and externally tested algorithms. Level 2 adds requirements for physical tamper evidence and role-based authentication. Level 3 adds requirements for physical tamper resistance, identity-based authentication, and separation between interfaces. Level 4 makes the physical security requirements more stringent, requiring the ability to be tamper active, erasing the contents of the device if it detects various forms of environmental attack. So I think a good idea to know the new standard for the exam. In fact, I found it interesting that the official study guide for the ISC Squared Certified Cloud Security Professional exam talked about FIPS 140-2, but when I looked at the common body of knowledge, they called out FIPS 140-3 there explicitly. That exam was updated in late 2022. So given we're nearly 2 years beyond that milestone, it's safe to say you should probably be familiar with FIPS 140-3 for the exam. So touching briefly on the types of cryptographic modules for FIPS 140-3, we have the hardware variety, the software variety, and the cloud variety. So I think the cloud variety is the one you're most likely to work with based on the prevalence of cloud today. In fact, I work with the Microsoft Azure Key Vault all the time. And with these cloud key management systems, you can store multiple types of secrets there. Passwords, textual data, symmetric and asymmetric keys, HSM-backed keys, and even X.509 certificates. And most of these cloud-based solutions will simplify lifecycle management with some additional functionality, with creation, renewal, rolling keys potentially, and also revocation. I want to revisit a couple of other key management terms and concepts you should know for the exam. So there's level of protection that dictates that encryption keys must be secured at the same level of control or higher as the data they protect. And the sensitivity of the data dictates this level of protection as defined in the organization's data security policies. Not unlike what we hear with systems that are used to access sensitive data. The system needs to be secured at the same level as the data it's accessing. There's key recovery, which defines circumstances where you need to recover a key for a particular user without that user's cooperation, such as in cases of termination or key loss. And key escrow, where copies of keys are held by a trusted third party in a secure environment, which can aid in many other areas of key management. Key escrow comes up in conversations around disaster recovery and business continuity, law enforcement and government access, and regulatory compliance, to name a couple. So let's talk about the key management strategy for the encryption key lifecycle. Our encryption keys should be generated within a trusted, secure cryptographic module. That's where FIPS 140-2 and 3 come in. These are validated modules we'll use that provide tamper resistance and key integrity. Encryption keys should also be distributed securely to prevent theft or compromise during transit. So as a best practice, we encrypt keys with a separate encryption key while distributing to other parties. Encryption keys must be protected at rest and should never be stored in plain text. This includes keys in volatile and persistent memory. Clients, our users and trusted devices, will use keys for resource access as access controls allow. Our acceptable use policy sets guardrails for data usage. A process for revoking access at separation, policy breach, or device or key compromise. An example would be in PKI, you would revoke the certificate on the issuing certificate authority if there were a compromise. And finally, key destruction is the removal of an encryption key from its operational location. So key deletion goes further and removes any info that could be used to reconstruct that key. For example, in mobile device management systems, they remove certificates from a mobile device during a device wipe or retirement. We'd see that with Microsoft Intune or AirWatch. So I mentioned that we saw quantum key distribution as an example in 3.6.3 that does not appear in the 2021 official study guide, so worth covering. It's a secure communication method that involves components of quantum mechanics. It enables two parties to generate a shared random secret key known only to them, and the secret key can then be used to encrypt and decrypt messages securely. Now, an essential property of quantum key distribution is the ability to detect eavesdropping by any third party trying to gain knowledge of the key. That's because with quantum key distribution, eavesdropper interception introduces detectable anomalies. In quantum key distribution, the protocols assume a certain error rate expected due to natural imperfections, and the protocols define a threshold beyond which eavesdropping is assumed. A paradox of sorts in that the eavesdropper's listening in introduces a detectable anomaly. This is not the same as quantum cryptography, so don't draw any conclusions here. We do talk about post-quantum cryptography at some length in the 2021 course, and most of that material is going to come straight forward to 2024. So, going a bit further here, the main drawback of quantum key distribution is that it usually relies on having an authenticated classical channel of communication. That means, essentially, the parties have already exchanged either a symmetric key of sufficient length or public keys of sufficient security level. So in practice, one can achieve authenticated and sufficiently secure communication without using quantum key distribution at much less expense. QKD is used only to produce and distribute a key, not to transmit any message data. So that begs the question, where is quantum key distribution used? Well, it's used in commercial solutions currently that target high security scenarios that use key distribution by courier, where key distribution schemes are considered inadequate. So essentially, QKD is a bit of a niche player today. To round out Domain 3, we need to talk about managing the information system lifecycle. So what is the information system lifecycle exactly? Well, it's a structured framework for managing an information system from its initial conception to its eventual retirement. It outlines the key phases involved in planning, designing, and building, deploying, operating, and maintaining, and eventually decommissioning a system. The goal of the information system lifecycle is to ensure a system is developed and managed in a way that meets business needs, remains secure, and operates efficiently throughout its lifespan. So let's step through the 9 phases of the lifecycle called out in the syllabus. So it begins with stakeholder needs and requirements. We identify the needs and requirements, essentially the problems the system needs to solve, the goals it needs to achieve. We define functional and security features required. So our key activities here include gathering requirements, conducting stakeholder interviews, and defining the project scope. In terms of security goals, we want to establish the baseline security expectations for the system. This includes understanding confidentiality, integrity, and availability needs, as well as identifying any compliance requirements. Moving on to the next phase, we have requirements analysis, where we analyze and refine the requirements gathered to ensure they are consistent, complete, and unambiguous. So our key activities here include prioritizing requirements, creating requirement specification documents, and performing risk analysis. Ultimately, we map requirements to security controls and conduct feasibility studies. The security goal here is to translate high-level security expectations into detailed, actionable security requirements and controls. These should address the risks that we identified earlier in the process. Phase 3 is architectural design. We develop a high-level blueprint of overall architecture of the system, including hardware, software, network, and consideration to security and performance in the process. Key activities here include creating system architecture diagrams, evaluating architectural options, interfaces, data flows, and doing some threat modeling. Our security goal here is to incorporate security by design. Our architectural decisions should address identified risk, support security principles like least privilege, and aim for a defense in-depth approach. Phase 4 is development and implementation. This is the actual build, development, acquisition, or implementation of the system based on the architectural design, ensuring secure coding practices are followed. Key activities here would be developing or procuring hardware and software, conducting code reviews, and implementing security configurations. Our security goal here is to ensure secure implementation of the design. This includes secure coding practices, configuration hardening, and integrating necessary security tools. Step 5 is integration. So step 5 of the phase is integration, ensuring components function together and meet defined requirements by aligning with the overall system architecture. Our key activities here would be performing integration testing and documentation of integration issues. From a security perspective, our goal is to maintain integrity and security during integration, to identify and address potential security gaps or conflicts that arise from how the components interact with one another. Step 6 in the cycle is verification and validation. So this is where we confirm the system meets the intended requirement, that's verification, and addresses overall business and stakeholder needs, that's validation. Key activities here: employ various testing techniques, unit testing, functional testing, user acceptance, performance, security. We review the test results and obtain stakeholder feedback. From a security perspective, our goal is to rigorously test that security requirements are met, vulnerabilities are minimized, and the system doesn't introduce unacceptable levels of risk. We then move into step 7 in the cycle, transition and deployment. We move the system from development into the production environment in a controlled and secure manner. We develop implementation plans, we conduct user training, perform a pilot rollout, and execute a full system implementation. Our security goal here is secure and controlled transition. We protect data during migration, apply security configurations for production environments, and ensure operational security processes are in place. We then move into operations and maintenance and sustainment. This is ongoing operation and management of the system to ensure availability and performance. This includes troubleshooting, applying updates, addressing vulnerabilities, as well as incident response. So our key activities here would include executing system monitoring, patch management, configuration management, incident response, change control, all of what we'd call the care and feeding of this system. So our goal here is continuous maintenance of security posture. This includes all of the patching, vulnerability scanning, incident response, adapting controls to evolving threats that we would expect. Evolving our security posture, maintaining our security posture to make sure we stay one step ahead of the bad actors out there. And final phase of the life cycle is retirement and disposal. So secure decommissioning or disposal of the system when it reaches the end of its useful life or becomes obsolete. Focus here on preventing data exposure and respecting data retention periods will be absolutely critical. So key activities here include data archival, system decommissioning, and secure disposal of hardware and media. So from a security perspective, our goal is to prevent data exposure first and foremost. We want to focus on secure data sanitization, proper hardware disposal, and ensuring compliance with data retention requirements. Moving on, let's take a look at what's new in Domain 4, Communication and Network Security. Let's take a look at what's new in Domain 4, which starts with 4.1.2 IP version 6. Now in 4.1.5, Converged Protocols as a concept is not new to the exam, but we do see a couple of protocols here that weren't mentioned anywhere in the official study guide for the 2021 revision, and that's InfiniBand over Ethernet and Compute Express Link, so we'll talk about those two explicitly. 4.1.6 Transport Architecture. So we'll touch on data control and management planes here, and cut through and store and forward are some switching types that we'll touch on briefly. 4.1.7 covers performance metrics, so we'll touch on these 5, and then 4.1.8 discusses traffic flows north, south, and east-west, so we'll dig in there. 4.1.9 physical segmentation, 4.1.10 logical segmentation, and 4.1.11 micro-segmentation. So this is taking the segmentation discussion to new levels of granularity versus what we saw in the previous revision of the exam. There's a fair bit of virtualization and cloud technology in these discussions. 4.1.12 edge network, so we'll talk ingress, egress, and peering, so data flows and encryption come up here. 4.1.17 virtual private cloud, so this is a public cloud concept we'll dig into. So cloud coming to the surface in the 2024 revision. And 4.1.18 monitoring and management concepts. So a fair bit to dig into here in Domain 4. So we'll start with 4.1.2 IPv4 and IPv6. So I want to touch on IPv4 just for basis of comparison and to talk about the problems that led to IPv6. So IPv4 uses 32-bit addresses, allowing for around 4 billion unique addresses. Large portions of the address space are reserved or unused, contributing to the shortage of addresses. For example, we have 192.168.1.1. So the 32 bits comes from 4 8-bit segments, or octets they're called. And IPv6 uses a 128-bit address scheme, allowing for a ridiculous number of unique addresses. This is the next generation network layer protocol, the successor to IPv4 someday. But you see the number of unique addresses is tremendous, actually more available addresses in IPv6 than grains of sand on the earth. And that is great, though visually the address scheme looks a bit less friendly and human discernible. Something we will get used to over time. And 4.1.2 calls out 4 communication methods. There's multicast, which is a one-to-many communication method where a single packet is sent to multiple specific recipients. This is supported by both IPv4 and v6. There is broadcast, which is a one-to-all communication method where packets are sent from a single source to all recipients on the network segment. This is not supported by IPv6, but there are some workarounds that exist using multicast. Unicast, which is one-to-one transmission from one point to another point, the most common use of IP in both versions. And then Anycast, which is from a single source to the nearest or most optimal recipient, or from a group of potential recipients. This is supported natively by IPv6. Moving on to 4.1.5 Converged Protocols. I mentioned there were 2 examples not covered in the 2021 revision of the official study guide. That's InfiniBand over Ethernet, which is a network protocol that allows remote direct memory access over an Ethernet network. It provides lower latency and higher throughput than Ethernet alone. And Compute Express Link, which is an open standard for high-speed, high-capacity CPU to device and CPU to memory connections. And we saw other examples covered in 2021. Fiber channel over Ethernet, iSCSI, voice over IP, all covered in 2021, still relevant, just let those ride. These protocols are considered converged because they run over the existing TCP/IP network. So 4.1.6 transport architecture, we need to touch on the management, control, and data planes. So the management plane handles configuration, monitoring, software updates, and security management. Our relevant protocols here include Simple Network Management Protocol and Network Configuration Protocol. We have the control plane, which is responsible for managing network routing protocols that facilitate communication between devices on the network. So here we have routing protocols like OSPF and BGP. And then the data plane is responsible for forwarding data packets between devices on the network. So stated simply, the control plane manages routing and determines optimal paths. The data plane forwards data packets based on control plane guidance. And the management plane configures, monitors, and maintains the network. Now within the data plane, there were some switching types mentioned on the 2024 syllabus. There's cut-through switching, where the switch makes a forwarding decision as soon as it receives the first part of the frame. We'd use cut-through when ultra-low latency is important or cost and simplicity is a high priority. We can potentially use less expensive equipment there. Then store and forward, where the switch waits to receive the entire frame before making a forwarding decision. So we use this when reliability is essential or the network less reliable. Next we have 4.1.7, which is performance metrics, and there were 5 network performance metrics called out. The first of which is bandwidth, which is the maximum capacity of a network channel to transmit data. Bandwidth represents the theoretical maximum data transfer rate, whereas throughput represents the actual data transfer rate achieved in practice. Throughput considers factors like latency, packet loss, and network congestion. Latency is the time delay between sending a data packet from its source to its arrival at the destination. So latency has an inverse relationship to throughput. Low latency means high throughput. High latency means low throughput. Then we have jitter, which is the variation in network latency over time. So jitter causes irregular delays in data packet arrival. Jitter affects the quality of service for real-time applications. And then there is signal-to-noise ratio, which measures the quality of a signal relative to the background noise. It's commonly used in wireless communication. High signal-to-noise ratio is good. Higher SNR indicates better signal quality and less interference. And in 4.1.8 we have traffic flows. First, east-west traffic, where traffic moves laterally between servers within a data center. In the east-west scenario, traffic remains within the internal network or cloud, and we'll use access controls, micro-segmentation, and isolation policies to raise security. Next, we have north-south traffic. This is where traffic moves to and from endpoints on the internal network to nodes on the public cloud or the internet. So in the world of cloud, this is where we're typically talking about data ingress and egress. When our traffic leaves the public cloud, we're not only worried about security, we're also worried about data costs. And this brings security concerns like data compromise, distributed denial of service, inadequate authentication. So we're a little more concerned because east-west traffic is really just trusted nodes and networks, and north-south traffic includes the untrusted. Next, we're going to get into physical, logical, and micro-segmentation, but I want to touch on reasons for segmentation first. So, boosting performance, one of the most obvious reasons. We can improve performance through a scheme where we locate systems that often communicate on the same network segment. Systems that rarely or never communicate are located on separate segments, separate subnets. And if they don't need to communicate, we potentially won't allow them to increase security. Segmentation reduces communication problems. It's going to reduce congestion, contain communication problems like broadcast storms to individual subsections of the network because we've cordoned off those nodes that need to communicate into their own segments. And this, of course, helps security. It improves security by isolating traffic and user access to those segments where they are authorized. I want to touch on a couple of terms that were included in the 2021 exam just for context here. We have the intranet, which is a private network designed to host the same information services found on the internet. So the intranet would typically include resources like your public file shares or your really internal company-wide file shares, your SharePoint site for your company portal, although the SharePoint portal is typically in the cloud now, so kind of turning that intranet concept on its ear from physical to logical. And then we have the extranet, which is a section of the organization's network that's been sectioned off to act as an intranet for the private network, but also serves information to the public internet. Kind of a cross between the internet and the intranet. And then we have the DMZ or DMZ, which is an extranet for public consumption. It's typically labeled a demilitarized zone or a perimeter network. So whether you hear perimeter or DMZ, two names for the same thing. But these segmentation strategies are used to control traffic and isolate static or sensitive environments. 4.1.9 covers physical segmentation, where we have out-of-band, which is physically separating network infrastructure into distinct security zones using hardware. Basically, alternate communication paths for different types of traffic. And then we have air gap, which is complete physical isolation of a network by having no wired or wireless communications. This would be common in high-security government networks and critical infrastructure like utilities. So in a government scenario, you might have an air gap network where authorized individuals are allowed to view secret data, classified information, for example. And when I say critical infrastructure, I'm talking about industrial systems that we might see in a manufacturing scenario or that we might see in a delivery scenario for public utilities like water and electricity, where internet access is not your priority. 4.1.10 covers logical segmentation. This is segmenting a network without additional physical hardware. We have in-band segmentation, where we're separating network segments by configuring routers, switches, and firewalls to control traffic flow. Techniques here would include subnets and VLANs. We have virtual routing and forwarding, which facilitates coexistence of multiple routing instances on a router simultaneously. This is fairly common in today's IP routers. Then we have the concept of a virtual domain, which is the network segments or chunks created through logical segmentation techniques like virtual routing and forwarding. So in the VRF context, they are called VRF domains. In 4.1.11, we have micro-segmentation, which takes the concept of logical segmentation to a more granular level by further dividing apps or workloads. The small segments or micro-segments contain a specific workload or functionally similar or even identical nodes. Policies and controls are then targeted to these micro-segments. This further limits scope of impact, outage, or breach, or lateral movement if we have an actual breach. We call this limiting the blast radius. In 4.1.12, we have edge networks. These are distributed networks that bring compute and storage resources physically closer to end users and devices on the edge of a network. So we have a few categories to consider here. We have ingress-egress. This is the entry point for traffic entering an edge network, usually from an end-user device or an external network. This is important for security monitoring and traffic shaping, because that's a boundary where we can limit what comes in and what goes out. We have peering, which is direct interconnection between edge network locations to allow traffic exchange without traveling through a central hub. This will reduce latency, often reduce cost, and eliminate central bottlenecks, which could become a problem in a hub and spoke topology. There's caching, where we cache popular content like video, audio, or web pages. This provides a better user experience in SaaS subscriber scenarios. We'd call that a content distribution network, or CDN. Truly most often called a content delivery network. In a compute scenario, granular compute functions can be containerized to provide low latency processing near end users and devices. This is known as edge computing. We see this come up in IoT and high-scale containerization scenarios where we might roll data up for some processing at the edge. So we might take data from 100 nodes in Cleveland, for example, and roll their data into a central edge location in Cleveland so we can process all their data, and then we might just send some summary data back to the cloud. Or we may have any number of functions there that can provide information to the nodes in that particular region or even smaller area. But edge computing in this case just limits what we have to send in terms of communication and data to and from a central cloud hub. And then storage at multiple edge locations reduces latency for access and updates. We see this in myriad functions for things as simple even as file services, where we have file shares that are synchronized across locations. 4.1.17 is virtual private cloud. So virtual networks, public and private subnets, segmentation, API inspection, and network integration between our environments are all important elements of cloud network security. And the virtual private cloud is a virtual network that consists of cloud resources where the VMs for one company are isolated from the resources of another company. And separate VPCs can be isolated using public or private networks and segmentation. This concept exists in all major public clouds. So AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud Platform all have it. The name varies by platform. So in Amazon Web Services, the term is VPC. On the Microsoft platform, it's called a virtual network or VNet. And in Google Cloud Platform, it's also a VPC. And to close out Domain 4, we have 4.1.18, monitoring and management. 4 key concepts to touch on here, beginning with network observability, which involves collecting data and gaining visibility into the status and performance of network components and traffic flows. It's this kind of visibility that supports issue identification and troubleshooting. We have traffic flow or traffic shaping, which is managing and controlling the volume and priorities of different types of traffic across network links. We'll see solutions here like quality of service, rate limiting, and throttling. Quality of service would allow us to give priority to certain types of traffic, like real-time traffic such as voice over IP traffic. Rate limiting and throttling would come into play, say with an API, for example, where we don't allow one customer to consume all of our capacity. We limit the number of requests they can make within a specific period of time, whether that's a maximum number of authentication attempts or a maximum number of calls to an API. Capacity management, which speaks to tracking network utilization and planning capacity expansion to meet future demands, essentially making sure we always have some breathing room as our network grows and to deal with those temporary spikes in traffic we may see in certain periods. And finally, fault detection and handling, which is discovering, diagnosing, and responding to problems like failed devices, connectivity losses, and performance slowdowns. Usually includes alerting, and failover may be automated. That brings us to Domain 5, Identity and Access Management. So what's new in Domain 5? Well, I'll start by saying there are no new major topics. There are a few topics moving around. We're not going to worry about anything that's of no consequence. There are a couple of new minor topics. There are others that are elevated to direct mention. For example, Passwordless comes up. So I want to talk to you for a moment when we get there about modern thinking when it comes to password management and authentication methodologies. So we have 5.1.6, which is services, and 5.2.1, groups and roles. Now, cloud computing and hybrid identity are likely to factor more prominently on the exam. They certainly factor much more prominently in real life. So we'll touch on some of those nuances as we work our way through Domain 5. 5.4.7, access policy enforcement. And the examples they give here are policy decision point and policy enforcement point. This is actually a zero trust architecture reference, and NIST has some additional reading I'm going to point you to. 5.5.5, service accounts. So 5.5, the major section there, covers the identity provisioning lifecycle. So there's a subtopic here. And if you were to compare the 2021 exam syllabus with the 2024 revision, you'll notice that 5.6.1 through 5.6.4 are all removed, but in reality they are likely simply moved under 5.6, which is implement authentication systems. I would say they have been consolidated, not deleted. This is really shifting focus from those individual protocols called out in 5.6.1 through 4 and looking more at a solution focus, a strategic focus in 5.6, not at all surprising on a security leadership exam. In 5.1.6, we have services in the context of controlling physical and logical access to assets. So controlling physical and logical access, whether that is on premises or in the cloud, in the office, or work from home. So we're looking at data and information, infrastructure and systems, devices, apps, cloud services, sites and facilities. Basically applying access control mechanisms, already covered in 2021, to assets, also already covered in 2021. I'd say this is a new line item that is largely coverage of existing topics. In 5.2.1, we have roles and groups. So groups are collections of users or devices that share common access requirements for resources. Groups can streamline management of permissions at scale. It's much faster for me to give permissions to a file share to a group which contains 1,000 people versus giving those 1,000 individual people the same permissions to that file share. And then we have the concept of roles, which define specific rights and permissions granted to groups. Roles typically reflect job functions or responsibilities within an organization. Within the cloud, we have roles that map to specific technical roles for completing common tasks. And I'll actually show you what I mean here in a moment to make this crystal clear to you. So key benefits: efficiency. It provides centralized management of access control policies, streamlining administration across different scenarios, and security, enforcing data privacy and the principle of least privilege by tailoring permissions to roles. 5.2 is manage identification and authentication of people, devices, and services. So that's our context for this minor topic. And when you're thinking about roles and groups, we want to think about that function across different environments. So on premises, that's historically tied to physical servers and domain controllers like Active Directory, which offered granular control but could become complex to manage at scale. In the cloud, we have cloud providers like Azure or AWS that offer their own identity and access management systems. This allows for cloud-native groups and roles, templates, and security integration with those cloud platforms, definitely a bonus. And then we have the hybrid scenario where organizations typically synchronize groups and roles and often identities between on-premises systems and cloud environments. This ensures consistent security policies. And while we're focused here on roles and groups in the context of synchronized identity, it allows for single sign-on for users across on-premises and cloud resources, a better user experience. So if you've been around IT a long time, you probably have experience with Active Directory, but you may not have a lot of experience with cloud-native groups and roles. So I want to take a look at cloud-native roles so you can really onboard that concept for the exam. And CISSP is a cloud agnostic exam or a vendor agnostic exam, but just as an example to get the concept onboarded here, I'm going to show you roles in the Microsoft platform. So Entra ID, what used to be called Azure Active Directory, is Microsoft's identity platform, and I'm looking at roles here. So you'll notice here in the UI when I'm looking at the roles, they show me the role name and a description of what that role can do. And you see over here that the type is built in for many of these. So Microsoft has provided a number of built-in roles. So if I just look down the list, for example, Attribute Log Administrator, and it tells me this role can read audit logs and configure diagnostic settings for events related to custom security. So maybe I'm working with someone who's going to be focused on identity management. If I search for identity, I can find every role that includes the word identity and see what permissions are here. I see some business to consumer policy, I see identity governance, I see privileged role administrator, and a description of what that role can do. And you will notice up here, they offer a new custom role option where I can create a role of my own choosing and choose from a long list of permissions. And you see here they give me a description of the permissions I'd be selecting for each of those to craft my new custom role. So a role is kind of like a group that has the capabilities already mapped to it for the platform, for a specific scope. Roles are very common in the cloud identity provider context. They all have them. And in fact, to take least privilege to a more granular level, these cloud providers, Microsoft for example, will have an identity governance feature of some sort that allows me to time limit membership in a specific role. So I can look at a role, and if I look at my assignments here, I can have a role where the assignment is a time-limited thing. So for example, I have an application administrator here, and if I look at the settings for this role with this assignment feature, it says the activation maximum duration is 1 hour. So the user can come in and request that this role be activated for them, and then that permission will be revoked in an hour. And I can configure that sort of just-in-time role activation for any number of roles, and I can control the time limits around the duration. So that's what you'll see in your identity providers in cloud platforms if you haven't already had the opportunity to view that. But that's really how roles factor in the cloud today. I mentioned passwordless authentication received direct mention in 5.2.2 in the 2024 exam syllabus. So I'd like to talk through authentication methods in the multi-factor context, passwordless, and just current thinking about the best and most secure methods of authentication. So we have password, which is the least secure actually. When we move into multi-factor, we have at the simplest end text messages, SMS, or a voice confirmation where you receive a voice call and generally respond to the keys on the phone. We have password and an authenticator app, an app on your mobile device. We have oath tokens. So that oath token would be where you get the one-time code that changes every few seconds. You'll have oath in your authenticator app. Your authenticator app functions as a software oath mechanism, in fact. Now, the Authenticator app, just to touch on that for a moment, can be used as a primary form of authentication to sign into popular cloud identities. We've probably all done that either with Microsoft or Google or others. It can also be used as an additional verification option during self-service password resets or multi-factor authentication events. For example, to use Microsoft Authenticator, you have to download the phone app and register your account with your company's tenant, with their Microsoft Azure tenant. And in that case, the app is available for Android and iOS. The additional verification I'm talking about here, that's your second factor of authentication. So going back to our chart, we saw oath token. So what is an oath token and how does it work? Well, oath is open authentication. It's an open standard that specifies time-based, one-time password codes. We see that 6-digit code. Software oath would be, for example, that Microsoft Authenticator app. It generates the secret code or seed that's input into the app and used to generate each one-time password. And then you have a hardware oath token, which is a small hardware device that looks like a key fob. It displays a code that refreshes every 30 or 60 seconds with a secret key seed that's pre-programmed. Software oath is much more convenient and I think equally secure as a mechanism, generally speaking, in most cases, just due to practical behavior. So we have the Authenticator app, the software and hardware oath, and then we have passwordless. And passwordless has quickly become the type of authentication that is considered best. We can do that through Windows Hello for Business on the Windows platform. We can do passwordless through the Authenticator app, where you're just using that app, potentially your face or fingerprint biometric, depending on your mobile platform. We have the FIDO2 security key, which is great, but requires you to carry around a physical FIDO2 security key. But why is passwordless so attractive? Well, for one thing, passwordless is convenient. It's also secure, but it reduces phishing exposure. So when a user gets that phishing email and says, hey, click here to go reset your password, if they're not using a password, they don't have a password to reset. So it's going to reduce their exposure in those cases. Those are the pros. Now, if I look at the cons of passwordless, it does introduce cost, potentially, if we go the FIDO2 key route. Biometric concerns can come up. We are asking users to use a face or a thumbprint, and device dependence, although if we're using the Authenticator app route, it's a device the user is already interacting with all the time and already using for multi-factor, so less a concern. So FIDO2, just to touch on that other option, it uses public key or asymmetric cryptography for user authentication. The user has a physical device, usually a USB or NFC based device. And the sequence is the user provides their username, there's a cryptographic challenge, they use the FIDO key to sign the challenge, the service verifies the response, and grants access. And then there's Windows Hello for Business, I mentioned. So this is an authentication feature built into Windows 10. It replaces passwords with strong two-factor authentication on PCs and mobile devices. It allows users to authenticate to a Microsoft account and Entra ID, formerly Azure Active Directory, to identity provider services or a relying party service that supports Fast ID online, the FIDO2 authentication standard. We have Windows Hello, which is for personal devices that uses a PIN or a biometric gesture. And then we have Windows Hello for Business that leverages key-based or certificate-based authentication, but it replaces passwords. It is passwordless. And I don't expect you're going to see questions on Windows Hello for Business, but I wanted to give you a picture of how passwordless authentication is implemented, so you have that leadership knowledge. So Windows Hello for Business solves a few problems, just to touch on these. Strong passwords can be difficult to remember, so that's really solving the problem of users writing down passwords, for example, potentially. So this is less about problems Windows Hello for Business solves and more about problems that are solved by passwordless on the whole. Server breaches can expose symmetric network credentials, your passwords. Passwords are also subject to replay attacks, and users can inadvertently expose their passwords due to phishing attacks. So for our exam purposes, for our strategy purposes, the problems solved here by Windows Hello for Business are really the problems that we're solving through passwordless authentication. Now, if we look at the authentication methods and their relative strength and security, we know password is the least secure of the options. Moving to multi-factor with SMS or voice prompt is one step better, but still not recommended. We then have the Authenticator app and the software and hardware oath tokens, and then ultimately passwordless would be considered the best case. And in fact, if we look at the authentication methods and their relative security, usability, and availability, you see that Hello for Business, the Authenticator app, FIDO2, all high across all three categories. And as we move down the list, your oath tokens are a bit less secure. We see a hardware oath token is a bit less. It's down to medium on the usability because we have to carry a device around. We see SMS and voice going a bit further down the list. Then, of course, password, the least secure, but highly available and easy enough to use. So again, don't read too much into any vendor references I mentioned throughout this talk. I just wanted to give you a flavor of how we look at authentication strategies in the world today. Now, before we get into 5.4.7, which is access policy enforcement, just a refresher on a couple of zero trust concepts and some information I think you'll find useful for the exam. So zero trust is an approach to security architecture in which no entity is trusted by default, and it's based on three principles: assume breach, verify explicitly, and least privileged access. As an aside, I'd say zero trust has largely replaced the trust but verify methodology, which involved a network perimeter beyond which everything was untrusted. And zero trust is supported by defense in depth that advises a layered approach to security. But zero trust addresses the limitations of that legacy network perimeter-based security model. It treats identity as the control plane. It assumes compromise and breach in verifying every request. Again, no entity trusted by default. So let's get into 5.4.7, Access Policy Enforcement. So here we have the policy enforcement point, which is responsible for enabling, monitoring, and terminating connections between a subject, like a user or a device, and an enterprise resource, what we'd fundamentally deem an object. It acts as a gateway that enforces access control policies. When an access request occurs, the policy enforcement point evaluates the request against predefined policies and applies the necessary controls. For example, the policy enforcement point might enforce multi-factor authentication for access requests from unexpected locations, dynamic based on conditions or context in that case. And then we have the policy decision point, which is where access decisions are made based on various factors like user identity, device health, and risk assessment. The policy decision point evaluates the context of an access request and decides whether it should be allowed, denied, or subjected to additional controls. In short, it considers the 5 W's, the who, what, where, when, and why, and the policy enforcement point enforces the policies at the connection level, while the policy decision point makes access decisions based on contextual information. I'm going to take you a bit deeper through some additional concepts related to access policy enforcement and the policy enforcement and decision points. So we're going to talk about Zero Trust Network Architecture from the perspective of the control plane and the data plane. So on the control plane side, we have adaptive identity, threat scope reduction, policy-driven access control, the concept of a policy administrator, and a policy engine. This really drives the policy-based decision logic for zero trust. And on the data plane side of the house, we have implicit trust zones, the subject and system, and the policy enforcement point. This enforces the decisions defined in the control plane. This is all described in NIST Special Publication 800-207, and you will see these functions implemented in solutions from identity providers. Once you onboard the concepts I see here, you're going to see these functions in products that you work with in the future that implement enterprise identity, be it on-premises, hybrid, or purely public cloud. Now let's talk through the elements of our control and data plane list, starting with the control plane. We have adaptive identity that changes the way the system asks a user to authenticate based on the context of the request. For example, user location, device health, are they using an approved app? What is the user's current risk level, which we might determine through user entity behavior analysis in our backend system. There's threat scope reduction, which is an end goal of zero trust network architecture to decrease risks to the organization. Policy-driven access control. These are controls based on a user's identity rather than simply their system's location. An example here would be the conditional access feature in Microsoft Entra ID, which allows us to create policies that consider all of these elements: location, device health, the app they're using, current level of risk, what resources are they attempting to access. We have the policy administrator, responsible for communicating the decisions made by the policy engine. This is a function, not a person. And then the policy engine that decides whether to grant access to a resource for a given subject. So Microsoft Entra ID, Azure Active Directory, is the underlying policy engine in the example I gave a moment ago. And the policy administrator and policy engine functions together give us the policy decision point functionality. So let's shift gears and talk through the data plane, starting with implicit trust zones, which are part of the traditional security approach in which firewalls and other security devices formed a perimeter, and systems belonging to the organization were placed inside that boundary. In the context of our discussion here, we have the subject and the system, the subject being a user who wishes to access a resource. A system is a non-human entity, often the device used by the user, to access the resource. And the policy enforcement point: when a user or a system requests access to a resource, it's the policy enforcement point that evaluates it against the predefined policies and applies the necessary controls. That's Microsoft Entra ID, formerly Azure Active Directory, as an example. Let me give you a visual to tie all this together. So we have our logical diagram with our control plane and our data plane. The policy enforcement point lies in the data plane. We have the policy decision point in the control plane, which again is comprised of the policy administrator and the policy engine. Hopefully that makes clear that policy administrator is a function, not a person. We have our subject and our system, so the user and their device, and they are untrusted at this point, making a request, which is evaluated by the policy enforcement point. That's where the security controls are applied, and if they meet all of the requirements of that adaptive policy, they will be granted access to the resources. So the security controls are applied by the policy enforcement point. The policy decisions are made up here in the policy decision point. So moving on to 5.6, we have service accounts. So when software is installed on a computer or a server, it may require privileged access to run and access other resources. It may need access to other systems, other data like back-end databases. Essentially, a lower-level administrator account without human intervention, and that's where the service account fits the bill. So to say it another way, a service account is a type of administrator account used to run an application. So like an account to run an antivirus application, for example. We sometimes hear service accounts called a service principal. That's cloud speak often. You'll hear that. So in the cloud, a similar concept exists for cloud resources like virtual machines that provides an identity for that resource to access other resources. So a VM would have an identity it can use to access other resources like data. Major CSPs all have them, though the name varies. It's managed identity in Azure, service role in AWS, service account identity in Google Cloud Platform. But least privilege and lifecycle management are all equally important for service accounts. And they should be provisioned for that new application when it's rolled out. That service account should be deprovisioned when that application is retired. So they have their own lifecycle management. In the cloud, we do see that some of these cloud resources like VMs that get an identity, that identity is managed by the platform. It's tied to that VM resource. So when the virtual machine is deleted, the identity is automatically cleaned up, so the life cycle is tied to its resource. Back on premises, that's typically not the case. Okay, moving on. I want to revisit 5.6, implement authentication systems a little more directly. So in the 2021 exam, we saw 4 subtopics that included OpenID, SAML, Kerberos, and Radius. And in 2024, this was consolidated down to simply implement authentication systems. I would argue that 5.6.1 through 5.6.4 have not disappeared in the 2024 exam. They've simply been consolidated here, and the focus pointed more toward the solution rather than the protocol level components, the options that we might roll in there. And you can chalk some of that up to changes we've seen in identity in the last several years with the rise of public and hybrid cloud. So again, OpenID, OAuth, SAML, Radius, still relevant, but the focus is just on the solution. To wrap up Domain 5, I want to take a sidebar and have a look at 5.2.6, which is Credential Management System, which was present on the 2021 exam revision, but they call out Password Vault as an example. And I want to talk about the concept of the Password Vault and the cloud equivalent we use for secrets storage, as I believe they're both going to be relevant on the exam. So the Password Vault is stored locally on a device and stores passwords so the user does not need to remember them. Generally using strong encryption, AES 256 or similar for secure storage, though only as secure as the owner password that is used to protect the vault itself. Often uses multi-factor authentication, but there is a type of password vault of sorts that exists in the cloud for DevOps scenarios, and all your major cloud service providers, your CSPs, have a solution, We refer to those typically as a key management system. But CSPs offer this cloud service for centralized secure storage and access for application secrets called a vault. Now in Azure we call that Key Vault, AWS and Google Cloud Platform call it Key Management System. So it varies by platform. This is a platform agnostic exam, so we're not worried about those branding. But a secret is anything you want to control access to. It could be API keys, passwords, secrets, tokens, or cryptographic keys. And the service will typically offer programmatic access via API to support DevOps and CI/CD, continuous integration and continuous deployment. Access control is handled at a Vault instance level and often at a secrets level within. And secrets and keys can generally be protected either by software or by FIPS 140-2 Level 2 validated HSMs. Or maybe even FIPS 140-3. That brings us to Domain 6, Security Assessment and Testing. What's new in Domain 6? Well, there are no new major topics, but there are a couple of minor but very important topics. Cloud is a factor in both. So we have two minor topics under subdomains 6.1 and 6.5. So under 6.1, design and validate assessment, test, and audit strategies, we have location. So they added a fourth line item here versus the 2021 revision. And under 6.5, conduct or facilitate security audits, we have location again, a fourth item added again. And some may tell you these are exactly the same, but they're not exactly the same because there is context, right? There's design and validate and conduct or facilitate. So we need to look at location in the context of design and validation and the actual conduction or facilitation of those security audits. So we have location, and location is of concern as audit strategy and execution change in the public cloud. And I would put forward that's really what's different about this. Our approach changes in the cloud in part because location is a bit more nebulous in the cloud with regards to high availability and redundancy, and our right to audit is different in the cloud. So let's just dive into location in the context of design and validate. So with each of these location models comes its own challenges, and you want to be familiar with the distinctions on the exam. So in the context of design and validate, with on-premises, physical access is very important. The auditors typically need physical access to hardware, network devices, and data centers for inspection, configuration reviews, and testing. Control and visibility. So the organization retains greater control over its infrastructure, thus auditors have more direct visibility into security configurations. Now, scope is another question. Audits may be focused on traditional IT infrastructure, like network security, operating systems, physical safeguards. But when we go to the cloud, everything's going to change a bit. So we have shared responsibility, number one. Security is a shared responsibility between the organization and the cloud provider, sometimes called the cloud consumer or customer and the cloud provider. Audit focus shifts towards how the organization uses those cloud services. Documentation and APIs. At this point, auditors are going to rely heavily on cloud provider documentation, service configurations, and access to relevant APIs for gathering evidence. And there's a compliance focus here, emphasis often on meeting cloud-specific security standards like the SOC 2, ISO 27001, and FedRAMP, and the organization's configuration of cloud services. Your cloud service providers will provide their attestation documents for certification of the underlying infrastructure, but it's still on the customer when they're configuring a service to configure it in a compliant fashion. Oftentimes, your cloud service provider will give you a well-architected framework or a cloud adoption framework that outlines how you should configure, but it's up to you to do so as the customer. You can't transfer that responsibility back to the provider. And again, the customer right to audit is often limited, so it's important to understand the rules of engagement when it comes to penetration testing, or how you get your hands on that audit data or post-audit report. And then we have the hybrid scenario. So in hybrid, we're going to be dealing with increased complexity in many cases. Hybrid environments often present the greatest complexity due to the mix of on-premises and cloud components that need auditing. Data flows are important, and understanding how data moves between on-premises and cloud environments is crucial for risk assessment. And integrated controls. Auditors must evaluate the effectiveness of security controls across the entire hybrid landscape. And we may not have integrated controls. There may be one set of controls for on-premises, another for the cloud. So for the auditor, they have to sort through the complexity of how these environmental components in the cloud and on-premises work together, how the data flows, how the security controls are implemented. Which means that auditor is likely going to need documentation from the cloud service provider and from the customer to get a complete picture. But hybrid means hybrid cloud in this case. I'm talking about an environment where we have a corporate data center or data centers connected to the public cloud. So let's talk about assurance challenges with virtualization and the cloud. So the cloud is made possible by virtualization technologies that enable these dynamic environments that are needed for a global provider platform. So depending on the cloud architecture employed, a cloud security professional may need to perform multiple layers of auditing. To be effective, the auditor must understand the virtualization architecture of the cloud provider. So the provider in this case, the cloud service provider, audits of controls over the hypervisor will usually be the purview of the cloud service provider. They alone have the right to audit on demand. Microsoft, Amazon, Google fall into that provider category in this context. The customer will have VMs deployed on top of that hardware. They're usually owned by the customer. They own most of the stack. You'll also hear them referred to as cloud consumers. So understanding right to audit in public cloud scenarios is very important. So the use of vulnerability scanners and pen testers may be limited by your cloud service provider's terms of service. So customers should understand the type and frequency of testing the CSP allows. Your CSPs typically have penetration testing and scanning rules of engagement that will tell you what the guardrails are for performing your own penetration tests. And a lot of these details come down to managing your contracts with your cloud service providers and understanding what's included, what's covered, what's restricted in the contract clauses. So you have right to audit. So a customer can request the right to audit the service provider to ensure compliance with the security requirements agreed in the contracts. Contracts are often written to allow the CSP's standard audits they've conducted with third-party auditors, SOC 2, ISO 27001, to name a couple, to be used in place of a customer-performed audit. In terms of metrics, if there are specific indicators that the service provider must provide to the customer, they should make sure they're documented in the contract, because they tell you how compliance with the agreement will be measured. But your major cloud service providers, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud Platform, and several others, make SOC 2 Type 2 or other audit reports available on demand, as submitting to every customer's audit request is simply not feasible. Later in this session, I will show you how to go find those audit reports in a CSP's cloud portal. So moving on to 6.2.2, penetration testing. We see exercise types mentioned here for the first time, and 3 teams were mentioned specifically. The red team, who are internal or external entities dedicated to testing the effectiveness of a security program by emulating the tools and techniques of likely attackers in the most realistic way possible. So the key there, emulating the tools and techniques of likely attackers. They are offense in this exercise, in this game, if you will. We have the blue team, the internal security team that defends against both real attackers and red teams in these exercises. They are defense. And then we have the purple team, also called out explicitly in the syllabus, that exists to ensure and maximize the effectiveness of the red and blue teams. Think of the purple team as process improvement. There's a fourth team not called out in the exam syllabus. I'll mention to you anyway because it matters. The white team, who is responsible for overseeing an engagement in a competition between a red team of mock attackers and a blue team of actual defenders. So that oversight makes them the judge or the referee, if you will. So moving on to 6.5.4, we have location, this time in a different context. So we're going to talk about on-premises cloud and hybrid, but we're talking about in the context of actually conducting or facilitating that security audit. So I want to focus on cloud in particular because this is really where it's going to matter on exam day. And I strongly suspect the increased focus on cloud is why location was added to each of those two subtopics. So the distributed nature and scale of the cloud make conducting an audit of 100% of your infrastructure very challenging. You generally cannot audit the underlying infrastructure managed by the cloud service provider. They own it. We can't simply audit on demand as customers, but we'll talk more about how we deal with that in a moment. Let's talk about the challenges the distributed nature of the cloud brings to the audit process and how auditors deal with that. So we know cloud computing enables distributed IT service delivery on a global scale, but often those systems can automatically replicate data globally as well. So one of the impacts of this distributed model is the additional geographic locations auditors must consider when performing an audit. And this may mean auditing 2, 3, 4 times the systems due to geographic redundancy and general disaster recovery configurations. So a common technique in cloud audits is sampling, which is the act of picking a subset of the system's physical infrastructure to inspect. So CSPs have found ways to collect evidence that provides auditors with sufficient assurance they have collected a representative sample. For example, sampling 20 of 100 servers across many regional data centers can save time and expense while still maintaining accuracy. Now, as I mentioned, you generally cannot audit the underlying infrastructure managed by the cloud service provider. So how does that work? What do we do as a customer? Let's get into that. On the topic of audit compliance, I'm going to lead you through 3 audit standards commonly used by the big public cloud providers. In fact, I'll tell you about these and then I'll show you how we get the audit and attestation documents from big cloud service providers like AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud Platform. Now, the 3 standards I'm about to take you through were all mentioned in the official study guide for the 2021 exam, and in fact, they were covered in depth in the 2022 update of another popular ISC² exam, the Certified Cloud Security Professional. Now, with both these facts and evidence, a month out from when the CISSP 2024 exam update goes live, I'd say there's a fair chance that at least one of these will come up. And if they don't, the next 5 or 10 minutes will definitely have real-world value as you help your organization navigate risk assessment and audit compliance around your cloud service providers. I call these cloud audit standards simply because they are relied upon by the cloud service providers and their customers to understand compliance of the cloud service provider. But they're certainly more than just cloud audit standards. They are used just as frequently in on-premises data centers around the world. And all 3 of these standards were mentioned on the 2021 revision of the exam. You'll find their mention in the official study guide. We're just going to go a bit deeper and look from a cloud perspective as well. So the first is SSAE, the Statements on Standards for Attestation Engagements. So the SSAE 18 is a set of standards defined by the American Institute of CPAs. That's Certified Public Accountants, if you're not familiar. And it's designed to enhance the quality and usefulness of system and organization control, or SOC, reports. It includes audit standards and suggested report formats to guide and assist auditors. And SSAE offers several report types. We have the SOC 1 report, which deals mainly with financial controls and are often used primarily by CPAs auditing financial statements. We have the SOC 2 Type 1, which assesses the design of security processes and controls at a specific point in time. And then there's the SOC 2 Type 2, and it's often written as Type 2 Roman numerals, which assesses how effective these controls are over time, typically by observing operations for at least 6 months. You can get these reports on demand from most of your major CSPs, but due to the sensitive content of these reports, it often requires an NDA that you'll sign in Portal. And then there's the SOC 3 report, which is more of a general use report. It contains only the auditor's general opinions and non-sensitive data, and it is publicly shareable. Now, the SSAE is US-based, but SOC 2 has become a de facto global standard, so you will see it used outside the US as well. And that SOC 2 Type 2 is the report most likely to be mentioned in an answer where SSAE audit reports factor. Next up, we have the International Standard on Assurance Engagement. So the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board issues the ISAE. Now this board and its standards are similar to those of the SSAE. The ISAE 3402 standard is roughly equivalent to the SOC 2 reports we saw from the SSAE. You will find the ISAE 3402 mentioned briefly in the 2021 official study guide. Also barely mentioned in 2021 is our third entity here, the Cloud Security Alliance. And the CSA offers the Security Trust Assurance and Risk, or STAR certification program, which can be used by cloud service providers, cloud customers, or auditors and consultants. It's designed to demonstrate compliance to a desired level of assurance. And with that in mind, the STAR consists of 2 levels of certification, which provide increasing levels of assurance. So again, we see the CSA STAR mentioned very briefly in the 2021 official study guide. We're going to go a bit deeper here, something closer to what you'd see on the Certified Cloud Security Professional exam from ISC Squared, because cloud definitely factors, as I've said. So STAR consists of 2 levels of certification. Level 1 is self-assessment. It's a complimentary offering that documents the security controls provided by the CSP. And Level 2 is third-party audit. This requires the CSP to engage an independent auditor to evaluate the CSP's controls against the CSA standard. It's stronger as it's a third-party audit conducted by a trained, qualified, and presumably impartial auditor. You can actually find more on the CSA STAR Registry and Assurance at cloudsecurityalliance.org/STAR. So how do you get your hands on these reports as a cloud customer? Well, I'll show you. I'm going to show you retrieving a SOC 2 Type 2 report from a CSP, and this is simply an example for context. I'll retrieve one from Microsoft Azure as my CSP. The process will vary slightly by cloud service provider, but will be roughly parallel in that you can find a report, and if it contains sensitive information, you'll likely be prompted to agree to an NDA. But let's go have a look. So I'll switch over to a browser, and I've navigated to servicetrust.microsoft.com, their Service Trust portal, and you'll see here if I scroll down, the different certifications, regulations, and standards are all listed. So if I'm interested in a SOC 2 Type 2 report, I would go to the SOC category here, and this is going to give me a list of the reports that are available. And if I scroll down here, it's going to render a list of reports, shows me the last update. Now, when there's no significant change, sometimes there won't be an audit repeated on certain intervals, and what they'll provide for you instead is what's called a bridge letter. So here I see, for example, a SOC bridge letter. But if I just scroll down here, for example, here is a SOC 2 Type 2 report for the Viva Engage service. So if I click on this link, it's going to take me to a PDF. Here we go, it shows me the report, and I can now download And here we go. And now I have the SOC 2 Type 2 report for that service. And out of respect for any perceived sensitivity, I won't go any further than that. But as you see, I can retrieve the audit documents I need to support my own organization's audit efforts as a consumer of the cloud directly from the CISSP with very little effort. So if you weren't quite sure how audit of your cloud service providers work before, now you know. That brings us to Domain 7, Security Operations. We do see some movement in Domain 7, and it's not all entirely new, but it's also significant, and I'll explain why. So 7.2.3 in the 2024 syllabus is Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response, or SOAR. It moved from its place in the 2021 syllabus in Domain 8.2, and that's because they moved SOAR right behind SIEM, Security Information Event Management. These two technologies go together, in the words of Forrest Gump, like peas and carrots. And I want to show you a bit about SIEM and SOAR so you understand strategically how those two work together and how they factor in your Security Operations Center. On the other hand, we see 7.5.3, Data at Rest, Data in Transit, also not new, appears to have moved from Domain 2, located in 2.6.1 of the 2021 syllabus. Nothing to see here really. We'll let that ride and we'll focus on the SIEM and SOAR discussion because I think that's meaningful to your understanding strategically. And then we have 7.12.6, which is net new. This is communications, and they offer stakeholders, test, status, and regulators as examples. So what's our context here? Well, 7.12 is Test Disaster Recovery Plan. So this is communications in the context of testing your disaster recovery. So let's start with SIEM and SOAR. So Security Information Event Management and Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response. So SIEM is 7.2.2 and SOAR was moved into Domain 7 right behind SIEM at 7.2.3. These two are commonly delivered together. They go together. So I'm not surprised to see them brought here, and I want you to understand their complementary nature. So the SIEM is a system that collects data from many other sources within the network. It provides real-time monitoring, traffic analysis, and notification of potential attacks. And SOAR provides centralized alert and response automation with threat-specific playbooks and runbooks. And we'll talk about the difference between playbooks and runbooks in just a moment. And the response may be fully automated or single click, what we'd call semi-automated. It depends on the circumstances and the tooling. But these capabilities are commonly delivered together in a single solution, and they often use artificial intelligence, machine learning, and threat intelligence to automate the identification of threats. So let's look at SOAR from another angle, and that's in the context of our tooling and response, our security operations. So SOAR is the tooling that allows an organization to define incident analysis and response procedures in what they call a digital workflow, so automating response essentially. So we have log collection that feeds the SIEM, that allows the SOAR to respond and provides actionable data to our Security Operations Center and our SOC analyst. So it integrates our security processes and tooling in a central location. The response automation using machine learning and artificial intelligence potentially. These make it faster than humans in identifying and responding to true incidents. It reduces mean time to detection and accelerates response. It uses playbooks that define an incident and the action taken. And again, the capabilities vary by situation and vendor, but we'll dig into playbooks and runbooks in a moment. And over time, this should produce faster alerting and response for the Security Operations Center team because we're using the log collection that's centralized in SIEM to feed response automation in SOAR at a scale faster than humans can do manually. So from a logging perspective, it's all about what you do with them. Logs are worthless if you do nothing with the data. They're only made valuable through review, whether that's manual or automated with solutions like SIEM and SOAR. That is, they're valuable if the organization makes use of them to identify activity that is unauthorized or compromising. Now, our SIEM tools can help solve some of these problems with common but key features. Log centralization and aggregation, data integrity, normalizing that data into a common event schema, automated or continuous monitoring, alerting, and investigative monitoring. We can automate some investigations, often at scale, whether that's investigating one potentially impacted endpoint or 1,000. That automation allows us to drive investigation and response at machine scale rather than human scale. And SIEM and SOAR are often integrated with SOAR runbooks invocable from the SIEM. So we can process in the SIEM with rules that will analyze the events for potentially malicious activity and then trigger some sort of automated response through the SOAR function. So we have the playbook I've mentioned a couple of times. That's a document or checklist that defines how to verify an incident. And the runbook, which implements playbook data into an automated tool. So the playbook is the paperwork, the runbook is the technology. And there are some tools out there, some that I work with, that actually refer to a runbook as a playbook. It doesn't really matter. For purposes of this exam, the playbook is the paperwork, the runbook is the automated tool, the technology, because we're looking at a vendor agnostic exam here. But your key SIEM features necessary to optimize event detection and visibility and to scale operations are really centered around log centralization and aggregation. So rather than leaving log data scattered around the environment on various hosts, the SIEM platform is designed to gather logs from a variety of sources, including your operating systems, applications, network appliances, cloud infrastructure, cloud services, user devices. They'll typically consume Windows event logs, Linux logs of various sources, syslog for sure for your network appliances. Many times you'll have third-party vendors work with popular SIEM solutions to provide API-level access into their appliances. So let's talk about how all of this comes together in the SIEM function. So when manual investigation is required, the SIEM should provide support capabilities like querying logs and generating reports, because sometimes we do want to proactively investigate manually. So your SIEM solution needs to have a standardized event schema that we can query across regardless of the log source. So we need to see identities, endpoints, apps, data, and infrastructure all queryable in a single interface. And that broad visibility across the environment means better context in log searches and security investigations. If I'm only looking at endpoint data, that gives me one facet of visibility into potential malicious activity. But if I can also see authentication attempts, I can see application activity over on my back-end databases, logs from my server infrastructure and my network infrastructure, it's going to allow me to look with a broader lens and to get a better sense of the scope and the potential reality that I'm dealing with a true malicious event. And SIEM and SOAR together allow us to take all of that log data and make complex response automation via SOAR possible. So as someone very familiar with SIEM and SOAR solutions, I can tell you with a fair amount of confidence that is why we saw SOAR moved from Domain 8 to Domain 7, but now you get a sense of how these two work together, and they facilitate automation of our investigative and response capabilities at scale. To close out Domain 7, we have 7.12.6, which is communications, and our context here is communications around testing our disaster recovery plans. Because DR testing communications encompass various internal and external stakeholders who have different needs and different communication preferences or methods that will be appropriate. So for our internal stakeholders, we have the disaster recovery team that needs reliable real-time channels for real-time coordination, problem solving, and decision making. So chat is often where we see this happening. Slack, Teams, Zoom, etc. Management needs periodic updates on progress and potential impacts on normal operations. That's email or text. The wider company needs general awareness and notifications ahead of scheduled tests to minimize confusion with pre- and post-test announcements to let them know when they have the all clear. External stakeholders, we have customers and clients. So in large-scale tests or real-life scenarios, proactive, controlled communications about potential service disruptions are very appropriate. And when impacts occur, ETAs for resolution are important for preserving trust and managing customer expectations. Our partners, if we have testing that may impact joint systems or operations, we want to inform partners with relevant timelines and agree on coordination channels. Regulators. Certain industries have reporting requirements. So for tests triggering significant downtime of regulated systems, advance notification or post-test reports might be mandated. And it often makes sense to include compliance experts in plan creation and testing. And that does it for Domain 7. And that brings us to the 8th and final domain, Software Development Security. So what's new in Domain 8? 8.1.1, Scaled Agile Framework, brand new in the 2024 revision. Now in 8.2.9, Application Security Testing, this is an existing topic, but we see two new items in the examples. Software composition analysis and interactive application security test are net new content not mentioned in the 2021 version of the official study guide. 8.4.5, Cloud Services. We see Software as a Service, IaaS, and PaaS all mentioned. Now the context here is 8.4, which is assessing security impact of acquired software. But again, calling out clearly that cloud computing is of elevated importance in the 2024 revision of the exam. So let's start with our software development models. So to fully appreciate the scaled agile framework, we really need to talk about some other software development methodologies. So we're going to cover them all here briefly because this space has evolved a bit since the 2021 revision. We'll begin with Agile, which is a model for software development based on the following four principles: individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. So the Agile model was first described in the Manifesto for Agile Software back in 2001. We really saw it come into practice around 2006. But it's really a model that involves the development team and their lead working with the customer and iterating through the development process. I really see Agile as the polar opposite of the waterfall model. Now, Scrum is an agile methodology that helps agile teams work together and deliver complex products. It's primarily used by software development teams, but it's grown to be accepted within other industries. So Scrum provides a specific set of rules, practices, and roles to put these agile principles into action. And that brings us to Scaled Agile Framework, or SAFe for short, which is a set of organizational and workflow patterns for implementing agile practices at an enterprise scale. SAFe includes structured guidance on roles and responsibilities, how to plan and manage the work, and the values to uphold. It promotes alignment, collaboration, and delivery across large numbers of agile teams. Scaled Agile Framework was developed leveraging three primary bodies of knowledge: agile software development, lean product development, and systems thinking. So Scaled Agile Framework builds on several agile concepts, and it's very important to remember SAFe doesn't replace Agile, rather it adds necessary layers to make Agile work in a large enterprise-level context. Coordination across teams, strategic alignment with the organization's business objectives, emphasizing quality as a non-negotiable aspect of delivery, architectural guidance for future evolution and scaling, cadence and synchronization through PI planning and demos, and lean agile leadership. So this is great when you have a large application portfolio and multiple teams, and your coordination is very important. It's critical to the business. Now that PI planning that I just mentioned there, PI stands for Program Increment. And in my experience in the Scaled Agile framework, that's a quarterly exercise where the group plans their work. Next, we have the waterfall methodology. And this is a project management methodology that's been around a long time. And it has 7 stages, from systems requirements, software requirements, preliminary design, the detailed design, code and debug, testing, and then operations and maintenance. Now, with these 7 stages, the waterfall model allows us to go back and make corrections. But we can only return to a previous stage, only one stage back. So it's a bit inflexible in that respect. You'll still see waterfall model used today, rarely in my experience, but it is still used in project management scenarios where a great deal of upfront planning is absolutely necessary. Critical infrastructure projects, maybe if you're working on a nuclear reactor, a public utility, I could see the waterfall model absolutely factoring in. It has its place, it just tends to be less common today. And then wrapping up our software development methodologies, we have the spiral model, which is a lifecycle model that allows for multiple iterations of a waterfall style process. It's known as a meta model or a model of models. Each loop of the spiral results in development of a new system prototype. It provides a solution to the major criticism of the waterfall model. It allows developers to return to the planning stages as demands change. In a word, spiral allows us to be iterative. And is probably the least likely to actually appear as the answer on an exam. It might be a distractor, and that's as much as I would expect to see. So that should give you a good picture of any software development methodologies that may appear on the exam. And moving on to 8.2.9, application security testing, I'm going to briefly cover 2 test methodologies that were included in the 2021 exam to establish context for one that was not. So we'll begin with static application security testing, which is analysis of software performed without actually executing programs. The tester has access to the underlying framework, design, and implementation. It requires source code access. On the other hand, we have dynamic application security testing, which is a program that communicates with a web application typically, and it executes the application. The tester has no knowledge of the technologies or frameworks that the application is built on. It is, by definition, a form of black box testing. No source code is required. It's sometimes said that static application security testing test from the inside out, and dynamic test from the outside in. And then we have interactive application security testing, which analyzes code for vulnerabilities while it's being used. It focuses on real-time reporting to optimize testing and analysis processes. It's unlike static and dynamic testing, interactive analyzes the internal functions of the application while it's running. And interactive application security testing is often built into CI/CD automated release testing. As I mentioned, interactive app security testing was new in the 2024 exam syllabus and not mentioned in the previous edition of the official study guide. Now, software composition analysis, also new in 2024. So software composition analysis is used to track the components of a software package or application. It's of particular concern for apps built with open source software components, because open source components often involve reusable code libraries. And your SCA tools identify flaws or vulnerabilities in these included components and ensure the latest versions are in use. It's often automated and combines application security and patch management. That brings us to 8.4.5, which is cloud services, infrastructure, platform, and software as a service. And Our context here is knowing the considerations around cloud services when assessing the impact of acquired software. So I really think of that as understanding the impact of our adoption of cloud services and what we need to focus on to be secure and successful here. So I'm going to list what I'll call the top 10 considerations. One could certainly debate the top 10, but I think this is going to give us a good broad range of conversation to cover the primary concerns to make sure you're ready for exam day, even if you don't have a lot of experience assessing cloud services adoptions. But a clear understanding of contractual responsibilities of your CSP is important for security, availability, and compliance. Understanding what you're responsible for as the customer from a security perspective, but also making sure you understand how your CSP is measured in meeting their availability and performance promises, their SLAs. So we'll start with number 1 on the list here, data security and privacy, and just work our way down the list of 10. So evaluating the CSP's data security measures, their encryption practices, and access controls is very important to confidentiality and integrity of your organization's data. Now, data residency and privacy, so thinking about GDPR, PCI, protected health information, may vary by the cloud services you choose. So when you're looking at a cloud service provider, it's not just whether or not that cloud service provider is PCI compliant or HIPAA compliant. That compliance is generally measured on a cloud service basis. So their cloud delivered PaaS databases might be PCI compliant, but their PaaS web platform may not be. So you really have to look at that on a per service basis. Shared responsibility. You want to know the shared responsibility model well and have clear definition of the responsibilities for each party to avoid any security gaps or overlaps. Know what your organization as the cloud consumer is responsible for and which areas your CSP is taking care of. And that will vary, based on whether you're working with infrastructure as a service platform or software as a service. But know your responsibilities with any cloud service hosting your apps or data. You also want to be familiar with the cloud service provider's security practices. So assessing the provider's security policies, their incident response procedures, and their track record in addressing security incidents. You want to know that your CSP is responsive when it counts. Multi-tenancy and isolation. So evaluating your CSP's tenant isolation mechanisms to ensure we avoid unauthorized access or data leakage between tenants. Logical and physical isolation options are fairly consistent across the big 3 CSPs, I'd say, at this point in time. So I'm talking about Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. But you'll still want to evaluate to make sure you find the right fit. Identity and access management. So assessing the CSP's identity and access management capabilities, authentication mechanisms, role-based access controls, and ensuring we have granular and potentially just-in-time control, so being able to elevate privilege and to revoke that on an automated basis just in time. You want to verify support for your app's preferred identity providers if your application has specific requirements. Monitoring, logging, and auditing. You want to evaluate the CSP's monitoring and logging capabilities, log retention policies, and the organization's ability to access and analyze relevant logs. Very important when we think about the 5 pillars and ultimately accountability. Cloud services hosting your app should have a consumable audit trail. Incident response and notification. So in the event of a security incident or a data breach, it's going to be very important to have a clear understanding of the CSP's incident response procedures and their notification protocols. Contractual details matter because you cannot transfer accountability. If your CSP is breached and your customer data is compromised, your organization's responsibility to your customers is the same. So if there's a breach and your CSP is to blame, you need to know that they're going to be appropriately communicative so you have the information you need to inform your customers. Then finally, compliance and regulatory requirements. So depending on your organization's industry and the type of data involved, there may be specific compliance or regulatory requirements that the CSP must adhere to. So assessing the CSP's compliance with these requirements and their ability to provide relevant certifications or attestations could be very important. And this could range from simple questions of data residency, where is your data going to be stored, to something more specific like PCI or HIPAA compliance. But the big three CSPs each have an area of their portal where you can download SOC 2 Type 2 reports and other reports with attestation of appropriate regulatory compliance. We actually looked at an example of that a bit earlier in our session. And then there's the matter of data portability and exit strategy. So organizations need to have a clear understanding of their ability to migrate or exit a cloud service or cloud platform entirely if necessary. You want to evaluate if the CSP's data portability capabilities, their export formats, and the organization's ability to retrieve its data in the event of service termination. This is very important for maintaining business continuity and avoiding vendor lock-in. And finally, we have supply chain security. So cloud services involve complex supply chains with multiple third-party components and services integrated into the overall solution. So evaluating the CSP's supply chain risk management processes is important to mitigate potential vulnerabilities or threats introduced through their supply chain. So hopefully I've given you a fair bit to think about here when it comes to considering your risks and responsibilities when it comes to adoption of cloud services. And that does it for Domain 8, but before you go, I have a little bonus for you. I have a strategy for answering difficult exam questions. It is easy to remember, and it works on all question types, including the complex types that are not simply multiple choice. It is the R.E.A.D strategy. Review, eliminate, analyze, and decide. Easy to remember, works on all question types, and actually works. I use it myself. I've now packaged this for you to onboard yourself. So it begins with the review. So we want to look at the question and determine what's really being asked. What's the true end goal we're solving for? Are there any process frameworks or regulatory requirements? Because we know regulatory and legal is going to trump standards, frameworks, best practices, right? We're then going to eliminate. So we'll look for unimportant details intended to distract us, and we'll just take those off the table. Do we see any answers that are definitely wrong? Let's eliminate wrong answers. It's a great idea, if possible, to eliminate 2 answers that you know are definitely wrong in a multiple choice scenario, because you go from a 25% to a 50% chance of guessing right if you're not exactly sure. Step 3, we analyze the solution requirements. If there are multiple solution requirements, we prioritize based on our CISO priorities: human safety, risk management, keeping the business running, ensuring that we're looking at regulatory and legal over standards, frameworks, best practices. And then, with the answers that remain, we evaluate each answer individually. What do we like about each? Is there one answer that is all-encompassing, that includes the others? Oftentimes, if there is, that's the one we'll want to choose. Because you will find on the CISSP exam, oftentimes, there are multiple answers that are plausible, but there's only one best answer. And at the end of the day, know your role. Remember your CISO priorities. And every time you walk through a question, quickly review, eliminate, analyze, and decide. You only have a little over a minute, as little as 1.2 minutes if you take 150 questions to complete the 2024 version of the exam. Now, let's talk about the other question types. You can apply the R.E.A.D strategy to what we call complex question types. So the other types would include hotspot, where you have to click on the correct part of a diagram to answer a question. Or a drag and drop question where you have to click, drag and drop each correct answer from the possible answer section to the correct answers box. Here is secret number 1. You can convert those questions to a traditional multiple choice question and process. So I'll quickly look at one of each with you. So let's take this drag and drop question type. So which of the following are hashing algorithms? Select all that apply by dragging them to the correct answers box. We have our possible answers, and we have to drag the correct answers over to the correct answers box. Converting this to multiple choice is very easy. We simply convert this to a multiple choice of 6, and select all that apply becomes our task. And then we apply the R.E.A.D strategy here again. And as with many questions on the CISSP exam, they're knowledge-based questions. So certainly we have to be prepared to assume that think like a manager, that leadership mindset, but we're still going to see many questions that require a fair bit of technical knowledge. So you couldn't simply reason your way through this if you don't have some familiarity with hashing algorithms versus encryption algorithms, for example. So let's talk about the hotspot question type, and I've crafted a primitive one here just to give you an idea. So you need to secure apps from inbound connections and secure users' outbound connections. You should deploy the least number of devices to meet the need. What do? Click each letter and select a number. So we have to pick the device that we're going to put in each place, and we see our goal here is to deploy the least number of devices to meet the need. So what I could do is write down the combinations I believe will secure apps from the inbound connections and also deal with users' outbound connections from the client side here. So what I could do is convert this into combinations of devices and again convert it to multiple choice, giving me those options in a multiple choice format, where I can then, again, apply the R.E.A.D strategy. But very easy to onboard this with just a minimal amount of practice. Review, eliminate the unimportant details, remove the definitely wrong answers, analyze the solution requirements, prioritize the requirements if there are multiple, remember your CISO priorities, evaluate each answer individually. What do we like? Do we have an all-encompassing? And choose your winner. I will make a deep dive video on the R.E.A.D strategy with 40 or 50 practice questions to give you some more color on how this strategy works, but I wanted to get you introduced so you can begin to leverage this and see if it works for you as you prepare for the exam. And with that, I say to you, congratulations, you've reached the end of my CISSP Exam Cram 2024 exam addendum. I hope you're getting value out of my series, both in 2021 and now my first, focused solely on the 2024 exam revision. Please reach out with any questions. You can reach me through the comments here on YouTube or over in LinkedIn. And until next time, take care and stay safe.